Good. So, you've heard of glands, haven't you? A gland is a structure or something which produces something. So we looked at lymph nodes last week, didn't we? And we found out that they weren't really glands because they don't really produce anything. But glands produce things. That's the business they're in. And there's two sorts. There's endocrine and there's exocrine glands. They are the two types. And the difference is that the exocrine glands have ducts. So you have a gland, for example, it might be a sweat gland, which is a coiled tube like this that goes to the surface of the skin. So sweat is produced in the bottom of the gland and it goes up this duct to get to where it wants to go. So exocrine glands export products from the glands via a duct. So you might think of salivary glands. They produce saliva, and then you have salivary ducts taking the saliva into the mouth. So exocrine glands export produced material from the gland via a duct. They export it. Now in the old days, the endocrine system used to be called the ductless gland system. It's a bit of a mouthful, ductless gland system. So we don't call it that now, we call it the endocrine system. But it is a series of glands where there is no ducts. The product is made in the gland, but it's not exported via a duct. And of course today it's the endocrine system we want to focus on. Endocrine. So in an endocrine gland there's going to be cells with nuclei, as you would expect. So they would be endocrine cells. And endocrine glands are well perfused with blood. They have an abundant vasculature running through them. So here we see one of the capillaries running through the endocrine gland. And in the endocrine gland there are secretory vesicles that produce the product. So whatever molecule it is that this endocrine gland is producing, it's going to accumulate in these vesicles. And then at the appropriate time, these vesicles will merge with the surface membrane of the gland, and that will release their contents. And the capillaries are very close by, so the contents essentially go straight into the blood. Now, some endocrine glands produce products that are used locally. They just diffuse locally. But the endocrine glands we're thinking about today, the main endocrine system, the endocrine product goes directly into the blood. So an endocrine gland releases its product directly into the bloodstream, and of course from there the blood can circulate to all parts of the body in the systemic circulation. The product can end up going everywhere. So that means, imagine this product is like this. You get this product in the blood. And of course the product of an endocrine gland is a hormone. hormone is the product of an endocrine gland. Systemically circulating in the blood. Now, can you see that this particular hormone is round, isn't it? It's a round one. That represents a particular molecular shape. So the different endocrine hormones produced by different glands have different molecular shapes. And the whole point is that the endocrine gland can communicate with body tissues. This is a communication system. So in the body, as you know, messages can be transferred around the place quite quickly, and coordination can be facilitated using neuronal transmission in the nervous system. This is an alternative way, or an additional way, that messages are transmitted around the body via endocrine hormones. So these hormones are circulating around the body, and then you come across a cell like this, and on the surface of this cell there is a square receptor. Is this round endocrine hormone going to fit neatly into that square receptor? No. So it's just going to float on past, isn't it? Not interested in that one. And then as it goes around the body, it might come across a cell with a triangular shaped receptor. Going to fit into that one? No, still no good, is it? But then it comes across a cell with a nice reciprocal shaped round receptor. You see, it can fit in there quite snugly, can't it? So it will fit in there. And this round hole where the hormone fits into is called a receptor site. And it's a protein, it's a receptor protein. But it's specific. A specific receptor has been engineered by this cell so it can receive this particular hormone, this particular endocrine product. So in this context, can you see that the hormone is the key and the receptor is the lock that the key fits into? It's the lock and key idea. Or to put it another way, the hormone is a signal. It's a signal molecule that fits into a particular receptor. A receptor protein. That makes this cell the target cell. And this cell will be part of the target tissue that the endocrine hormone is aiming to influence. So the ones it doesn't want to target are ignored because they don't have the right receptors. The one it does want to target, the signal molecule, fits into the receptor molecule. And that's good. Now, I've drawn the receptor molecule on the outside of the cell here. Sometimes there's receptor molecules inside the cell as well. Later on we might see that there's some hormones called steroids, and there's another hormone called thyroid hormone. In that case the receptor is inside the cell. In that case the hormone would diffuse into the cell and bind to the intracellular receptor. But it's the same. It's still a signal molecule binding with a receptor molecule. Now, once the signal molecule has bound into the receptor molecule, that will bring about additional changes inside the cell. that will bring about biochemical changes inside the cell. And they're specific networks of chemicals inside the cell waiting to spring into action when the signal molecule combines with the receptor molecule to give that signal. And the changes that go on inside the cell are mediated via what is called a secondary messenger system. And that brings about some physiological change in the cell. It will stimulate the cell to do something. And because the release of the endocrine hormone is coordinated, that means that the activity of the cells of the body can also be coordinated, functioning in an ordered, meaningful way to bring about this mysterious process of physiology. So in this context, the hormone would be called the primary messenger system, taking the message from the endocrine hormone to the cell. And the change that is brought about inside the cell would be the secondary messenger system. So we have two messenger systems coordinating physiological change inside the cell. And of course this can affect millions, billions of cells all at the same time, bringing about coordinated activity. That's basically how endocrine hormones work. Is that easy, or do you want a minute to talk about it? Is that easy? Okay, shall we go straight on to the next bit? Which bit?
When it goes into the cell.
Yep. So the endocrine hormone circulates in the blood. It ignores the receptors it doesn't fit into. When it does fit into the receptor that it fits into, it is the combination between the hormone and the receptor that triggers off the other changes inside the cell. So the hormone on its own can't trigger changes inside the cell. The receptor on its own can't trigger changes inside the cell. Any more than a key can open a door without a lock, or a lock can be opened without a key. You need both. Then when you've got both, the cell knows it's time to spring into action, and that combination of the hormone and the receptor, the signal and the receptor, that triggers off some physiological change inside the cell.
What kind of physiological changes is it?
Well, it depends very much on the type of cell and on the type of signal molecule. So, for example, we've already noted that if this was insulin and this was an insulin receptor, the change will be that the cell membrane becomes permeable to glucose molecules. And that will coordinate the regulation of blood sugar levels. Or, if this is another type of hormone that will bind inside the cell called thyroid hormone, the more thyroid hormone that binds into that receptor inside the cell, the more metabolically active the cell would become, and it would produce greater amounts of energy. So different hormones are coordinating different ranges of physiological activity in different tissues. But we'll see more when we learn about the individual endocrine glands. Good. Who knew that already? Is that easy? Done this somewhere before? Looking slightly stunned, but... Do you want to talk about that, or do you want to go on a bit? Go on a bit? Okay. So the endocrine system needs to be controlled and coordinated. And the main organ of control and coordination in the body, of course, is the brain, isn't it? 100,000 million individual neurons, between 1,000 and 10,000 synaptic interconnections per cell. This complicated coordinating organ. And there's a bit of the brain called the hypothalamus. So here's the bottom part of the hypothalamus here. So this bit here is the hypothalamus. It's one of the bottom parts of the brain. And at the bottom part of the hypothalamus is like a little stalk like this. And that little stalk widens into a lobe like this. And this lobe is part of what we call the pituitary gland. And it's actually the back of the posterior gland, so it's the posterior lobe. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. But the pituitary gland is only the layman's term. What do we call the pituitary gland? And if we're talking on the wards and we said pituitary gland, there's a risk the hoi polloi would understand us, isn't there? Can't have that. We need our own language. Anyone heard of it? The pituitary gland is the hypophysis. The hypophysis. So the pituitary gland is the hypophysis. And this back part of the pituitary gland, actually, there's big nerve cells in here that have big axons that run all the way down into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So really, this is kind of like an extension of the brain, really. There's big axons project down into it. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is made of neurological type tissue. It's almost like part of the brain. So it's called the neuro. It's called the neurohypophysis because it's made of neurological tissue. Well, it keeps me in a job and keeps students on their toes. No, it hasn't got three names. The whole gland, we haven't finished the whole gland is the hypophysis. We'll see there's another bit to it. Right? This bit of the hypophysis at the back is made of neurological tissue. So we call it the neurohypophysis. Neuro just means neurological, doesn't it? And hypophysis is the pituitary gland. Once you've written it out 100 times, it won't seem so bad. Now, because in surgery, there's a process called a hypophysectomy. Ectomy, removal of. So occasionally it becomes necessary to remove the hypophysis, to remove the pituitary gland in the process of hypophysectomy. Yeah, that could be one of the reasons for it. Right? Now, the front part of the pituitary gland, let's have a different colour. The front part of the pituitary gland is a larger lobe, like this. And front, of course, is anterior, isn't it? That is the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland is made of glandular tissue. And the prefix that means glandular is adeno. A-D-E-N-O, adeno. So the anterior pituitary is made of completely different tissue. If you look at a section of the pituitary gland, there's a completely obvious histological border between the two lobes. This is one type of tissue, neurological tissue, and this is a completely different type of tissue. It is glandular tissue. How do you spell what? Adeno. Adeno means to do with glandular tissue. Glandular. So we've got the neurohypophysis at the back and the adenohypophysis at the front. And this is glandular tissue. So let's think now about what these structures produce. And we'll just do a few examples of what they produce. But with the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary, it's quite easy. It only produces two things. So the neurohypophysis produces a hormone called oxytocin, and another hormone called antidiuretic hormone. Now, the thing that oxytocin is famous for is stimulating the contraction of the myometrium, the muscular part of the uterus, during childbirth. So oxytocin stimulates contraction of the uterus. And after the baby's been born, oxytocin also stimulates the smooth muscle in the milk ducts to facilitate lactation. It stimulates the process of what is called milk letdown. It stimulates the milk to go from the lobes of the breast where it's produced out of the nipple so the baby can suckle it. There's other things as well, but that's what it's famous for. Oxytocin also brings about a lot of emotional changes associated with childbirth and delivery, and generates feelings such as attachment and love, which of course are chemical reactions in the brain, aided by the oxytocin effect. Now, I think I'll rub this neuron out now, because these chemicals, these hormones, the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone, are actually produced in the hypothalamus and let down into the neurohypophysis for release. So we'll rub that one out. Now, the hypothalamus actually produces all sorts of hormones. So many hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. But these hormones are unusual in that they don't go into the systemic circulation. They just take a shortcut. So blood comes into the hypothalamus, goes round capillaries in the hypothalamus, where these hormones are absorbed into the bloodstream. But instead of going into the systemic circulation, they just take a little shortcut down to here. So there's a dedicated system of blood vessels that takes them down to here. And then once the blood is circulated through the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, through the adenohypophysis, the blood then drains into the systemic circulation. Quite unusual, isn't it? So it's a vein that begins in capillaries and ends in capillaries. When that happens, we call it a portal system. And there is only one other example in the body of a portal system, which is the other portal vein in the body. There's only one other one. No, that's in the kidney. Bowman's capsule's in the kidney. The other one goes from the gut to the liver. It's the hepatic portal vein. That's the only other one. And what's produced here are products that have different names in different textbooks, but we can call them releasing hormones. So releasing hormones, in very small amounts, go into the blood in the hypothalamus, go down through this portal vein into the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And it's only when these releasing hormones from the hypothalamus arrive in the pituitary gland that the pituitary gland releases its hormones. And the hormones from the pituitary gland are released directly into the blood. Into the systemic circulation. So the releasing hormones are produced in very small amounts in the hypothalamus and stimulate the release of releasing hormones from the anterior lobe of the hypothalamus, from the adenohypophysis. That's good because it means these can be produced in very small amounts. Because can you see they're going straight to where they're needed? Does that make sense? So they're not going to be diluted in all of the systemic circulation. They're just going to be kept in the relatively small volumes of blood going through this portal system to the anterior lobe. And the hormones that the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland produces are collectively called trophic. Trophic hormones. The hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland under the influence of releasing hormones from the hypothalamus are called trophic hormones. And it's these hormones that regulate the activity of the rest of the endocrine system. So the endocrine activity, or most of the endocrine activity in the body, is coordinated via trophic hormones released by the adenohypophysis to control the activity of the rest of the endocrine system. Now, when I was a student in the old days, people used to say that the pituitary gland is the master of the endocrine orchestra. It's kind of, you can come in now and you come in now. It's kind of conducting the whole show. But now can we see that the pituitary gland is actually only a puppet of the hypothalamus. It only does what the hypothalamus tells it to do. So the adenohypophysis only releases its trophic hormones when it's stimulated to do so with the arrival of releasing hormones via the portal system from the hypothalamus. So who's the real boss? The hypothalamus is strictly in charge of the whole thing, isn't it? It's the hypothalamus that's in charge. So the hypothalamus is the actual conductor of the endocrine orchestra. It's the hypothalamus that's controlling it. And not only does the hypothalamus produce the releasing hormones that control the release of the trophic hormones, the hypothalamus also produces the posterior neurohypophysis released hormones, which is the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. Amazing, isn't it? Clever hypothalamus. And it does dozens of other things as well. I mean, the reason you eat your lunch today is because the hypothalamus tells you to. It stimulates hunger, it stimulates thirst, it controls body temperature, it stimulates sexual activity. It does all sorts of things. It causes all sorts of problems, the hypothalamus. It sometimes means you eat too much, you see. It stimulates eating. What's a diuretic? No. What do you do when you get to the toilet? Yeah. A diuretic increases urine volumes, doesn't it? Diuresis means an abnormally large volume of urine. So diuresis is a larger volume of urine than normal. But this isn't a diuretic hormone, is it? It's not like giving furosemide and increasing your patient's urine volumes. It's an antidiuretic hormone. So what does this hormone do to urine volumes? It lowers urine volumes. So if the kidneys can get away with it, if the kidneys are just left to do their own thing, they'll produce about 20 litres of urine per day. That's what the kidneys like to do. I mean, you would be passing about a litre of urine per hour, wouldn't you? I mean, it would be seriously inconvenient. There is actually a disease where the hypothalamus doesn't make antidiuretic hormone. Do you know what it's called? It's called diabetes insipidus. Insipid, watery diabetes. It's a type of polyuria, diabetes insipidus. But don't worry about that today. So, it's the antidiuretic hormone that stops the kidneys producing 20 litres of urine per day. So the more water you want to conserve in the body, the lower you want urine volumes to be. Can you see that means the more antidiuretic hormone has to be released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. from the neurohypophysis. So it's an anti-diuretic hormone. I think I'll maybe just look at 2 or 3 examples of endocrine hormones released from the anterior. Well, one is growth hormone. Growth hormone. GH, the growth hormone. So why do children grow? Well, they grow because all the tissues that grow in the body, pretty well all the tissues that grow in the body, are coordinated by growth hormone. It is stimulating growth. Yeah.
Is that why when things like when you have like prostatic hypertrophy, is that to do with traffic?
That is a remarkably logical inference. But no, it's not. It's probably not an easy question, actually. Prostatic hypertrophy is caused by testosterone.
So it's still a hormone.
Yeah, if you castrate men, they don't get prostatic hypertrophy. So it's caused by testosterone affecting the mature pituitary gland. Whether that increased testosterone is affected by growth hormone or anything else, I don't really know. Probably the answer is no. Probably the answer is that prostatic hypertrophy is caused by the way the maturing pituitary gland reacts to the testosterone. It's probably not this. But it's a very logical thing to think. But too much growth hormone, you get a giant. You get people that are far too big, which is remarkably unhealthy. Very tall people don't do very well. Or not enough of this, of course, and you get a dwarf. That will cause dwarfism. So thankfully you're all kind of about the right height. So that meant when you were growing up, your pituitary gland was really quite smart, didn't release too much, making you a giant, didn't release not enough, making you a dwarf, released just the right amount, which is good. Now, this also controls the release of the, well, there's a hormone produced by the adenohypophysis that controls the activity of the thyroid gland, which we'll see in a minute. So this one's thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. So the activity of the thyroid gland in the neck is controlled by the amount of thyroid stimulating hormone released by the adenohypophysis. The amount of thyroid stimulating hormone released by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland is controlled by the amount of thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone produced by the hypothalamus. So that's an example of a trophic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, because that is causing the thyroid gland to release its endocrine product. Another example of a hormone produced by the anterior pituitary is adreno. Adrenocorticotrophic hormone. Adreno, well, that means to do with some glands we'll learn about later called the adrenal glands. Yeah, the adrenaline is produced in the adrenal glands, yes, but not in this part. This is the adrenocortico, and you might remember that the outside part of an organ is the cortex. So this is the adrenocortico. So we know it's affecting the adrenal gland. We know it's affecting the cortex. And trophic means to bring about a change or to stimulate. So can you see this hormone? It's a hormone, it's a chemical messenger, which is stimulating the adrenal cortex. It's adrenocorticotrophic hormone. ACTH.
How does alcohol have an effect on the antidiuretic hormone?
Good question. How does alcohol inhibit, or how does it affect antidiuretic hormone? And the answer is that alcohol directly inhibits the release of antidiuretic hormone. So the antidiuretic hormone is still produced, but when there's alcohol around, it's not released. So if you drink alcohol, that's going to inhibit the release of the antidiuretic hormone. If you have less antidiuretic effect, can you see that means you're going to have more diuretic? You're going to have more diuresis.
Is ecstasy the same but either way? Is ecstasy the same either way?
No, ecstasy affects something completely different. It affects different chemical transmitter systems in the brain. So if you have less antidiuretic hormone, you have more diuresis, that means you wee lot. Of course, that makes you dehydrated. That's what alcohol does. No, ecstasy affects chemical transmitters in the brain called serotonin, I think, mostly. 5-hydroxytryptamine. The one that kind of peps you up and gets you going.
But does it stop you urinate?
Oh, I don't know.
Because I was reading, GCSE, they taught
No. I think what ecstasy can cause, it can cause hyperthermia. I don't think it stops you weeing. I don't think it stops you drinking, but it causes hyperthermia. But if people are dehydrated when they have ecstasy, then they're more prone to hyperthermia. But this is kind of a malignant hyperthermia. So sometimes when you give certain drugs, it seems to affect the hypothalamus, turns the body temperature way up. And with ecstasy, it can turn the body temperature up so high it can kill you. It's quite dangerous. It would be called malignant hyperthermia. Learn about that when you do anaesthetics as well. It's a rare complication of anaesthesia. Right, so can you see that this is oxytocin, this is ADH, and they're trophic hormones. They're bringing about changes in the endocrine system. So what I want you to do is explain the anatomy and physiology of the hypothalamus and this pituitary gland that's on a stalk in 2 lobes. What's the neurohypophysis? Why is it called that? What does it do? What's the adenohypophysis? Why is it called that? What does it do? And how is its activity regulated by releasing hormones produced by the hypothalamus? Okay, go for that.